When my little sister got pregnant at 14, my parents made me wear a fake belly and pretend the baby was mine. When I told them she needed a doctor, they said, "The only thing dying here is your selfishness. Put on the belly." I didn't argue, I just looked at her. That was almost 2 years ago. Yesterday, I got a thank you card from her high school graduation, signed with 2 names. What's the worst lie your family made you tell? When my 14-year-old sister Stella got pregnant, my parents forced me to wear a fake belly and pretend the baby was mine, because they said her future mattered more than mine ever would. My parents had built their entire identity around being the perfect family with 2 accomplished daughters headed for Ivy League schools. Mom ran the church youth group while Dad served as deacon, and they paraded my perfect sister Stella around at every congregation event. When Stella came home from church camp sobbing and pregnant, I watched my parents' carefully constructed world shatter before they decided to rebuild it on my back. They called me into Stella's room where she lay curled up, looking so young it made my chest hurt. "You're 17, and you already dress like a war," Mom said, stroking Stella's hair while the kid shook with tears. "But Stella's only 14 with her whole future ahead of her. You're going to wear this belly and tell everyone you're pregnant." She pulled out the foam padding, and I stared at my little sister, remembering how I'd taught her to ride a bike, and felt fury battle with protectiveness. "She needs a doctor," I said. "She's 14 and pregnant. She could die." Dad's face went cold. "The only thing dying here is your selfishness. Put on the belly." Stella whispered, "I'm sorry," but wouldn't meet my eyes. I tried reasoning first, suggesting we could say Stella was sick and needed homeschooling while I finished my senior year. Dad responded by destroying my laptop with my college essays and scholarship applications, and said teen moms don't need those. Next I went to my school counselor, but when I started explaining, Mom had already called ahead claiming I was pregnant and in denial. The counselor offered me prenatal vitamins and adoption pamphlets. I wrote an anonymous tip to Child Services about a 14-year-old being denied medical care, but Mom intercepted it and locked me in my room for 3 days until I promised to stop making trouble. The padding grew heavier as they adjusted it weekly to match Stella's real progression. I snuck into Stella's room one night and found her crying, terrified about giving birth. "We could run away together," I whispered, holding her. "Get you real help," but she just sobbed harder. Mom says if anyone finds out about what he did to me, they'll say I wanted it. The father was a 23-year-old camp counselor who'd groomed and raped my little sister, and now our parents were holding both of us hostage rather than bring him to justice. I took photos of Stella's real belly while she slept, planning to take them to the police, but Dad caught me. He didn't yell. Instead, he drove me to the roughest part of town at 2 a.m. and left me there. "Walk home," he said. "Think about how much worse things can get for girls who don't listen." It took me 4 hours in the dark, terrified and alone, clutching my fake belly like a teddy bear. After that night, I knew my next plan had to be smarter. I contacted a cousin who'd escaped our family years ago and begged for help. She agreed to drive down and get both Stella and me during the birth when our parents would be distracted. For weeks, I kept her updated, sending her money so she could help me and Stella get an apartment, and promised Stella we'd keep her baby together somewhere safe. When she went into labor, Dad drove, and Mom coached Stella through contractions in the back seat, and I texted my cousin the hospital name. But we arrived to find my cousin already there, sitting with my parents' pastor. "Your mom called me last week," my cousin said without meeting my eyes. "She reminded me about my own mistakes at 17. I think you girls need your parents' wisdom." The betrayal felt like drowning. My parents smirked at me as they watched my last hope get crushed. Stella delivered a healthy girl despite her age, and my parents made her sign papers putting her up for adoption, without even letting Stella hold her. Stella was too weak from blood loss to even understand what was happening until it was too late. The next morning, she sobbed when she realized her baby was gone forever. "I named her Grace," she told me, her body shaking. My parents forced me to pretend the baby I'd supposedly delivered had been stillborn because they didn't want the adoption gossip. I wore black and accepted casseroles from church ladies while Stella recovered alone and hidden away. The town treated me like broken glass, whispering about the teenage mother who'd lost her child as punishment for her sins. I moved through the days like a ghost, working at a grocery store where customers either avoided my eyes or stared with pity. Every night I heard Stella crying through the walls, mourning the daughter she'd never hold again. I started community college in January, driving an hour each way so I could escape my family without abandoning Stella. She went back to school too, thinner but maintaining her perfect grades while I bagged groceries until midnight to afford textbooks. We barely spoke anymore because looking at each other meant remembering Grace. Then in March, Stella started throwing up at breakfast. Mom found the pregnancy test in her trash and called me home from work. The counselor had threatened her, saying he'd expose the truth behind her pregnancy unless she met with him, and then he forced himself on her again. "So you'll put the belly back on," Dad said, like we were discussing weather. "Tell everyone you got pregnant again. Stupid girls do that all the time." I stared at them. These people who would protect a predator to save their reputation and their twisted vision of Stella's unspoiled future. I refused. Mom said, "Then we'll tell everyone you forced Stella to lie about being raped because you were jealous." Who will they believe? The godly parents or the slutty teen mom? I looked at my parents, these monsters who'd sacrifice both their daughters to protect their image, and something inside me finally snapped. Not into pieces, but into place, like a lock clicking open. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed Mom's phone from the counter. She lunged for it, but I held it high, scrolling through her contacts. Dad moved toward me, but I backed against the wall, finding what I needed. Pastor Williams' number. I started typing a text while they shouted threats. Mom grabbed my wrist and twisted until I dropped the phone. It shattered on the tile floor. Dad dragged me to my room and shoved me inside, locking the door from the outside. Through the walls, I heard Stella crying, begging them to let me out. For 3 days, they kept me locked up, sliding food under the door. I used the time to plan. They thought breaking me down would make me comply, but each hour alone just hardened my resolve. I scratched notes on paper, mapping out every person who might help, every possible escape route. When they finally let me out, I emerged calmer than they expected. I nodded when Mom handed me the foam belly. I strapped it on on without argument. Dad smiled, satisfied that I'd learned my lesson. They had no idea I was done being their victim. At work that night, I cornered my manager Jess in the break room. She'd always been kind to me, bringing me leftover soup when I looked tired. I pulled up my shirt to show the fake belly, then pulled it off completely. Her eyes widened as I explained everything in rushed whispers. Jess drove me home at the end of my shift, but when we arrived, Mom stood on the porch with 2 church elders. They'd anticipated this move too. Jess looked between us all, confused and overwhelmed. The elders spoke softly about troubled teens and rebellion. Mom cried perfectly on cue. Jess left without me, shooting worried glances over her shoulder. The next morning, Mom made me wear the belly to church. I sat through service feeling the weight of every stare, every whispered prayer for the poor girl who couldn't stop sinning. Stella sat 3 rows ahead, shoulders hunched, looking smaller than ever. After church, I found Stella in the bathroom, throwing up again. Not from morning sickness this time, but from pure anxiety. I held her hair back and we didn't speak. We didn't need to. I saw the same desperation in her eyes that burned in mine. That week, I tried everything. I called the school counselor from a payphone, but she said she'd already heard about my second pregnancy and offered more adoption pamphlets. I walked to the police station during my lunch break, but the officer at the desk was Dad's golf buddy. He called Dad before I could even file a report. Each failed attempt taught me something. My parents had spent years building their network, their reputation. Everyone saw them as pillars of the community, but that same network had cracks, people they'd wronged or overlooked. I remembered Mrs. Burt from down the street, whose daughter had mysteriously left for boarding school last year. I knocked on her door one evening when my parents thought I was at work. She let me in without questions, poured tea, and listened. When I finished, she sat quietly for a long moment. Mrs. Burt couldn't help directly, she explained. Her own family's secrets kept her bound, but she told me about her nephew Pablo, a social worker in the next county. She wrote his number on a napkin and pressed it into my hand. Sometimes, she said carefully, help comes from unexpected places. I hid the number in my shoe and went home. Dad checked my pockets now, my phone, my room, but he never checked my shoes. Small victories mattered when you had nothing else. At school, I started documenting everything. Not obviously, but in ways that looked like normal homework. English essays about family dynamics, health class projects about teen pregnancy. Each assignment contained carefully worded truths that might someday matter. Stella grew sicker each day. The counselor had threatened her again, demanding another meeting. What exactly is happening with this counselor that the parents won't report? They're going through all this trouble with fake bellies and lies, but they're letting this man keep hurting Stella? She refused to eat, terrified of gaining weight and showing. Mom forced nutrition shakes down her throat while Dad held her arms. I watched from the doorway, memorizing their cruelty for the day I could make them pay. One night, I snuck into Stella's room and found her writing what looked like goodbye letters. I grabbed them, read the first line, and my blood went cold. She was planning to hurt herself rather than go through this again. I held her while she sobbed, promising her we'd find a way out. I just needed more time. The next day, I called Pablo from the grocery store phone during my break. His voice was professional but kind. I explained everything in under 5 minutes, knowing my manager would notice if I took too long. Pablo listened, asked careful questions, then said he'd need documentation. Real evidence, not just words. I started taking pictures with a disposable camera I bought with tip money. Stella's growing belly when she changed. The adoption papers they'd forced her to sign, which I found in Mom's desk. The fake belly they made me wear. Each photo was a risk, but also a piece of ammunition. Dad must have sensed something shifting because he started driving me to and from work, eliminating my freedom of movement. Mom began sitting in my room while I did homework, reading her Bible and watching me with cold eyes. They were tightening the net, but they didn't know I'd already started cutting holes in it. I kept Pablo's number hidden in my shoe for a week, waiting for the right moment. Mom's surveillance grew more intense. She installed a baby monitor in my room, claiming she needed to make sure I wasn't harming the baby. The irony burned as I strapped on the fake belly each morning while Stella's real one grew hidden beneath baggy sweatshirts. The disposable camera became my lifeline. I photographed everything I could reach. Bank statements showing large cash withdrawals around the time of Grace's adoption. The camp counselor's photo from the church bulletin board that Mom kept in her desk drawer. Medical bills addressed to Stella that Mom thought she'd hidden well enough. Each click of the shutter felt like loading bullets into a GN I'd eventually fire. Work became my only escape, but even that freedom shrank. Dad started showing up randomly during my shifts, browsing the aisles while keeping me in sight. My coworkers noticed his presence, whispering about the overprotective father of a pregnant teen. I smiled and played the part while rage simmered beneath a foam padding. One evening, a new customer came through my checkout line, Mrs. Dubwa from church, whose own daughter had left town suddenly 2 years ago. She studied my fake belly with knowing eyes, then slipped a folded paper between the groceries. I pocketed it quickly. Later in the bathroom, I read her message. I know what they're doing. Call me when you're ready. I memorized her number and flushed the paper. Another ally, another crack in my parents' perfect facade. But I needed more than sympathy. I needed proof they couldn't deny or explain away. Stella's condition worsened daily. She fainted during dinner one night, hitting her head on the table edge. Blood trickled from the wound while Mom dabbed at it with a dishcloth, insisting she just needed rest. I tried to call an ambulance, but Dad ripped the phone from the wall. They carried Stella to her room and locked us both inside. I cleaned her wound with tissues and water from the bathroom tap, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. Her skin felt too hot, her breathing too shallow. The camp counselor had done more than assault her again. He'd broken something inside her that our parents refused to see. The next morning, Mom unlocked the door wearing her church smile. She handed me prenatal vitamins and reminded me about my doctor's appointment that afternoon. The appointment where I'd have to convince a medical professional that my foam belly contained a real baby. The thought made me sick. At the clinic, I sat in the waiting room surrounded by actual pregnant women. Mom chatted with them about morning sickness and baby names while I sweated beneath the padding. When the nurse called my name, Mom stood to follow. The nurse shook her head, citing privacy policies. Mom's jaw tightened, but she sat back down. In the examination room, I pulled off the fake belly and showed the nurse my flat stomach. She stared, confused, as I rapid-fired the truth. Her expression shifted from bewilderment to horror. She promised to help, to call someone, to fix this. But when we emerged, Mom had already spoken to the doctor. They discussed my psychological issues and pregnancy denial, while the nurse stood frozen, outmaneuvered by my mother's preparation. The ride home was silent. Mom had won another round, but I'd seen something in that nurse's eyes. Not everyone believed their lies. The cracks were spreading. That night, I heard Stella crying again. Not her usual quiet sobs, but sharp, pained sounds. I picked a lock with a hairpin I'd been practicing with and found her curled on the floor, blood staining her pajama pants. This time I didn't hesitate. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed Dad's car keys from the hook. Mom appeared in the doorway as I helped Stella stand. Dad emerged from their bedroom, blocking our path to the front door. They demanded I put Stella back in her room, that they'd handle it in the morning. I looked at my sister's gray face, felt her weight against me, and made my choice. I drove Dad's shoulder into the wall and pushed past him. Mom grabbed Stella's other arm, trying to pull her back. Stella screamed, a sound that should have broken any mother's heart. Instead, Mom just pulled harder. I shoved her away and half-carried Stella to the car. Dad caught up as I fumbled with the keys. He grabbed my wrist, twisting until I dropped them. Stella collapsed against the car door, breathing in short gasps. In that moment, watching my father choose his reputation over his daughter's life, something cold and clear crystallized inside me. I kneed him in the groin. He doubled over, gasping. I snatched the keys and shoved Stella into the passenger seat. Mom ran toward us, but I'd already started the engine. We peeled out of the driveway, leaving them standing in the headlights. The hospital emergency room was bright and busy. I carried Stella inside, shouting for help. Nurses surrounded us, whisking her away on a gurney. I tried to follow, but security stopped me. I wasn't family, they said. The irony might have been funny if Stella wasn't dying. I called Pablo from the hospital payphone. This time I didn't whisper or rush. I told him everything while watching the emergency room doors. He said he'd come immediately, that this changed everything. I gave him the hospital name and collapsed in a waiting room chair. Mom and Dad arrived 20 minutes later. They spoke to the receptionist in calm voices, playing the concerned parents perfectly. When they approached me, Mom's hand closed around my arm like a vice. They tried to force me to leave, to come home where we could discuss this as a family. Security intervened when I started screaming. Not words, just sound. Pure rage and fear pouring out of my throat. They separated us, making my parents sit on the opposite side of the waiting room. Dad's eyes promised retribution. Mom clutched her purse, no doubt planning her next move. Pablo arrived before they could try again. He wore an official badge and spoke with quiet authority. My parents' faces went pale as he introduced himself. He'd brought a colleague, a woman who specialized in cases like ours. They separated us for interviews. I handed over the disposable camera, showed them the photos on my phone, recited dates and incidents I'd memorized. The woman took notes without judgment, asking careful questions that drew out details I hadn't realized mattered. Meanwhile, Pablo spoke with my parents, his calm voice carrying across the waiting room. A doctor emerged after 2 hours. Stella was stable but needed surgery. The pregnancy had been ectopic, growing in the wrong place. Without immediate treatment, she would have died. The doctor's words hung in the air like an accusation. Mom tried to spin it, claiming they'd been about to bring Stella in themselves. The doctor's expression suggested she'd heard such lies before. She asked pointed questions about prenatal care, about why a 14-year-old's pregnancy had progressed so far without medical attention. Dad's answers grew increasingly fumbled. Pablo's colleague pulled me aside. They'd need to place Stella in protective custody while investigating. She asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I thought of Mrs. Dubwa's knowing eyes, of Mrs. Burt's quiet tea ceremony. I had options now. The surgery took 3 more hours. I dozed in the uncomfortable chair, jolting awake whenever footsteps approached. My parents had been escorted to a separate waiting area after Dad tried to corner me in the bathroom. Their kingdom was crumbling, brick by brick. When Stella woke up, I was there. Her eyes focused slowly, confused by the hospital room. I held her hand and explained what happened, watching tears slide down her cheeks. The baby was gone. The counselor's second assault had nearly culled her, but she was alive, and for now, that was enough. Pablo returned with paperwork. Emergency custody orders, investigations into medical neglect, mandated reporting about the counselor. The legal machinery ground into motion, slow but inexorable. My parents could no longer stop it with phone calls and tears. They tried, of course. Mom called her church friends, spinning tales of rebellious daughters and social workers overstepping bounds. But Mrs. Dubwa had been busy too. She'd spoken with other mothers, ones whose daughters had also left suddenly. The pattern was becoming clear. Dad attempted a different approach. He showed up at my work with my belongings, playing the heartbroken father just wanting his daughter home. The fake belly meeting the real medical staff is comedy gold, until you remember there's a dying kid involved. Nothing like trying to convince a nurse your foam padding needs prenatal care while your sister bleeds out at home. Jess, my manager, stood beside me as I refused. He left the boxes by the door, but not before slipping an envelope into my hand. Inside was a check for $5,000 and a note, "For your silence." I photocopied both and gave the originals to Pablo. More evidence, more nails in their coffin. The investigation expanded, reaching into corners my parents had thought secure. The church board started asking questions. The youth group parents demanded answers. Stella spent a week in the hospital. I split my time between her room and work, sleeping on waiting room chairs and showering in the employee bathroom. My fake pregnancy became real exhaustion, dark circles replacing foam padding. But for the first time in months, I could breathe. The camp counselor was arrested on a Tuesday. I wasn't there, but Mrs. Dubwa called to tell me. He'd been working at another church camp 2 counties over. They found evidence of other victims. My stomach turned, thinking of other Stellas suffering in silence. Mom tried one last manipulation. She showed up at the hospital with Stella's favorite stuffed animal and tears streaming down her face. She begged Stella to come home, promised things would be different. Stella looked at me, then at the teddy bear, then at our mother. She took the bear and asked Mom to leave. The foster family Pablo found specialized specialized in cases like ours. Mrs. Yamamoto had been a nurse before becoming a foster parent. Her house smelled like green tea and safety. Stella got the pink room she'd always wanted. I got a lock on my door that only I controlled. We testified in separate rooms, Stella via video link because seeing him made her vomit. I sat in the witness chair and spoke every truth they'd tried to bury. The prosecutor had photos from my disposable camera blown up as exhibits. Mom's forged medical documents, Dad's threatening texts, the fake belly, which I'd kept as evidence. Our parents sat in the gallery, shrinking with each revelation. Their church friends filled the other seats, but support had shifted. Mrs. Dubwa sat behind us. Mrs. Burt sent flowers. Even Jess came on her day off, wearing her best dress. The counselor got 15 years. Not enough, but something. He'd serve at least 10 before parole. Other charges from other victims would keep him longer. Stella cried when they read the verdict. Good tears this time. The case against our parents moved slower. Child endangerment, medical neglect, conspiracy charges that made Dad hire an expensive lawyer. Their savings drained as their reputation crumbled. The church quietly removed them from leadership positions. Mom's youth group disbanded. I started college that fall, a year late but determined. The scholarship I'd thought lost had been held by a sympathetic administrator who'd heard whispers of my situation. Stella entered therapy, real help instead of prayer circles. She painted Grace's name on a canvas that hung in her new pink room. We saw our parents at the grocery store sometimes. They'd aged years and months, their perfect facades cracked beyond repair. Mom once tried to approach us, but the restraining order stopped her at 50 feet. Dad just stared, perhaps finally understanding what he'd lost. Mrs. Yamamoto helped us navigate the legal system. Emancipation for me at 18, permanent guardianship for Stella, victim compensation funds for therapy and education. Piece by piece, we rebuilt what they'd tried to destroy. The town's whispers changed. No longer about the teen mom who'd lost her baby, but about the girl who'd saved her sister. About parents who'd valued image over children. About secrets that couldn't stay buried forever. The truth, messy and painful, proved stronger than their perfect lies. Stella started high school at a different district. No one there knew our story unless she chose to tell them. She joined the art club and made friends who knew her as more than a victim. On Grace's birthday, we released balloons at the park, watching them disappear into clouds. I worked fewer hours, focused on pre-med courses. Helping Stella through her medical crisis had shown me a path forward. Jess wrote recommendation letters that spoke of strength under pressure. Pablo checked in monthly, proud of our progress. The investigation uncovered more than we'd known. Financial fraud related to the adoption. Forged documents at the church. A pattern of covering for the counselor that reached back years. Our parents faced charges that multiplied like cancer cells, eating away at their constructed life. Some nights, Stella still cried for Grace. I held her through the grief, understanding that some wounds never fully heal. But she smiled more too. Painted vibrant canvases, talked about becoming an art therapist. She wanted to help other girls who'd been silenced. Mom sent letters we didn't open. Dad tried going through lawyers, then relatives, then church friends. Each attempt met the same response: silence. We'd given them years of our voices. Now they got nothing. The final custody hearing approached like a storm system. Our parents' lawyer would argue for reunification. Pablo warned us to prepare for emotional manipulation, for promises of change. But Stella and I had learned to weather storms. We gathered evidence of our new life. Stella's improved grades, my college acceptance, photos of birthday parties and normal teenage moments, testimonials from teachers and counselors who'd watched us heal, proof that we'd thrived without them. The hearing was set for a Thursday. We'd face them one last time, speak our truths to a judge who'd decide our future. But whatever happened, we'd already won the important battle. We'd survived. We'd protected each other. We'd refused to live their lies. Wednesday night, Stella painted bold strokes of color that formed into wings. Not angel wings, but bird wings, strong enough to fly away. She signed it with her name and Grace's, intertwined like sisters who'd never meet but would always be connected. I packed our documents, the photos, the evidence of everything we'd overcome. Tomorrow would bring either freedom or another fight. But tonight, we ate takeout and watched movies. Two sisters who'd learned that family meant choosing each other over everything else. The morning would come soon enough. For now, we had this: truth, survival, and the knowledge that we'd already struck the worst they could do. The rest was just paperwork. Thursday morning arrived with gray skies that matched my mood. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me look responsible but not trying too hard. Stella wore the blue dress Mrs. Yamamoto had bought her for special occasions. We ate breakfast in silence, both pushing eggs around our plates. Mrs. Yamamoto drove us to the courthouse, her steady presence calming my racing heart. Pablo met us in the parking lot with his colleague and a thick folder of documentation. He reviewed our testimony one last time, reminding us to stick to facts and avoid emotional outbursts. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Wood paneling and fluorescent lights made everything look washed out. Our parents sat at a table with their lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone. Mom wore her church dress, the one with tiny flowers that made her look harmless. Dad had shaved and wore his deacon tie. The judge entered and we all stood. She was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes that surveyed the room carefully. Pablo had said she specialized in family cases, that she'd seen situations like ours before. I hoped that was true. Our parents' lawyer went first, painting a picture of a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. He talked about loving parents who'd made mistakes under stress, about teenage rebellion and outside influences, about the importance of keeping families together. Each word felt like sandpaper on my skin. When Pablo stood to present our case, he started with the photos, the fake belly, medical records showing Stella's age during both pregnancies, the adoption papers signed under duress, bank statements, text messages, the evidence mounted like a wall between us and our parents. I testified first, keeping my voice steady as I recounted each incident. The lawyer tried to twist my words, suggesting I'd been jealous of Stella, that I'd exaggerated for attention. I stuck to facts, describing the night Dad left me in the dangerous neighborhood, the locked doors, the forced padding. Stella testified via video link from another room. Her voice shook as she described the camp counselor, the threats, the second pregnancy. She had to stop twice to compose herself. The judge's expression grew harder with each detail. During a recess, I saw Mom in the bathroom. She stood at the sink, gripping the edge like it might hold her upright. Her reflection looked hollow, aged. She saw me in the mirror but said nothing. We existed in that silence for a moment before I left. The afternoon brought character witnesses. Mrs. Dubwa described her suspicions, the pattern she'd noticed. Jess talked about my work ethic despite everything. Teachers from Stella's new school discussed her progress. Each testimony added another brick to our foundation. Our parents' witnesses were fewer. Church members who spoke in generalities about their good character. People who'd known them for years but had never seen inside our home. Their words rang hollow against the evidence. The judge called a final recess before her decision. We waited in a small room that smelled like old coffee and anxiety. Stella drew patterns on a legal pad while I paced. Pablo sat quietly, having done all he could. When we returned, the judge spoke for 20 minutes. She outlined the evidence, the testimonies, the legal standards. She talked about the best interests of children, about patterns of abuse and control, about parents who'd chosen reputation over their daughter's well-being. The decision was comprehensive. Pablo's keeping evidence of a $5,000 bribe makes me wonder why these parents think money fixes everything when there's already an investigation happening. The counselor getting arrested at another church camp suggests someone new and just moved him around instead of stopping him. Permanent guardianship to Mrs. Yamamoto until I turned 18, then to me for Stella. Supervised visitation only, if we chose to allow it. Continued therapy mandated for all parties. The restraining order would remain in place. Our parents' lawyer immediately mentioned appeal. The judge cut him off, stating the evidence was overwhelming. She looked directly at our parents and said the court had shown more mercy than they'd shown their daughters. Mom broke down then, not her practiced tears, but raw, ugly sobs. Dad put his arm around her, but his face stayed blank. They looked smaller somehow, like all their power had evaporated under the courtroom lights. We left through a different exit to avoid them. In the car, Stella reached for my hand. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that our intertwined fingers didn't already communicate. That evening, Mrs. Yamamoto made a special dinner. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and garlic bread, but it felt like a feast. We ate on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. Stella showed me a new painting she'd been working on. Two birds on a wire, leaning into each other against the wind. She'd used every color in her palette, creating something beautiful from chaos. I recognized us in those birds. The next few days passed in a blur of normalcy that felt foreign. No locked doors, no fake bellies, no threats, just regular life things like homework and chores and arguing over TV shows. Stella laughed at something stupid on her phone, and the sound made me cry. I returned to work, where Jess had decorated my register with a small sign that said, "Welcome back." Customers treated me like any other cashier, not knowing the girl scanning their groceries had just won the fight of her life. Pablo called to check in, reminding us about resources available, support groups we could join when ready, legal aid if our parents violated the order, numbers to call if we needed anything. We filed it all away, hoping never to need it. One afternoon, I found Stella in her room holding the teddy bear Mom had brought to the hospital. She wasn't crying, just staring at it like it might hold answers. I sat beside her and we talked about complicated feelings, about loving people who'd hurt us, about moving forward without forgetting. School became my refuge again. My professors didn't know my story, just saw a student hungry to learn. I threw myself into pre-med studies with new purpose. Every anatomy lesson reminded me of Stella in that hospital bed, strengthening my resolve. Stella joined the school play, surprising everyone including herself. She played a minor character, but threw herself into rehearsals. On opening night, Mrs. Yamamoto and I sat in the audience, cheering too loudly when she delivered her 3 lines perfectly. We established new traditions: Sunday morning pancakes instead of church, movie nights where we picked films our parents would have banned, small rebellions that felt like reclaiming ourselves. The grocery store where I worked hired 2 new people, letting me reduce my hours to focus on school. I trained them carefully, remembering how work had been my only escape. You never knew who might need that job like a lifeline. Stella's therapy sessions started showing progress. She came home lighter some days, like she'd set down invisible weights. She started talking about the future again, about art school possibilities, about becoming someone who helped kids like her. We got a letter from the lawyer handling the criminal case against the camp counselor. More victims had come forward. His sentence would likely increase. Stella read it once, then asked me to file it away. She was done letting him take up space in her head. Mrs. Yamamoto taught us to cook her grandmother's recipes. We spent evenings in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and learning about her childhood in Japan. She shared her own story of leaving a difficult family situation, showing us that survival could lead to joy. I started volunteering at the hospital on weekends, shadowing nurses and doctors. One recognized me from Stella's emergency visit. She said nothing but squeezed my shoulder in understanding. The medical world was full of people who'd seen the worst and still chose to help. Stella's grades improved beyond what they'd been even before everything happened. Her art teacher recommended her for a summer program at the local college. She applied without telling me, wanting to surprise me with the acceptance letter. We ran into kids from our old church sometimes. Some avoided us, others asked careful questions. A few admitted they'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't known what to do. We didn't blame them. Speaking up was harder than staying silent. The restraining order meant we could shop without fear, walk through town without looking over our shoulders. Freedom felt strange at first, like wearing new shoes that hadn't been broken in yet, but each day it fit a little better. Stella painted Grace's portrait from memory on what would have been her first birthday. We framed it and hung it in her room, a reminder that love persists even through loss. Some nights I still heard her crying, but now I could go to her, hold her, remind her she wasn't alone. My college advisor helped me apply for additional scholarships. My essay about overcoming adversity won a small grant that covered textbooks for a year. I wrote about resilience without mentioning specifics, protecting our privacy while sharing our strength. Pablo sent updates about our parents' legal troubles. Multiple charges were proceeding. Their lawyer kept filing motions that judges kept denying. Their money dwindled as their reputation crumbled further. Natural consequences playing out exactly as they should. We decided to get a cat, something our parents had always forbidden. Stella picked an orange tabby from the shelter who purred like a motorboat. She named him Sunny, and he slept on her bed every night, a warm presence that eased nightmares. Spring arrived with possibility. I got accepted to the pre-med program at the state university. Stella's art was selected for a student showcase. Mrs. Yamamoto's garden bloomed with vegetables we'd planted together. Life grew in spaces that had once held only pain. On a random Tuesday, Stella hugged me in the kitchen for no reason. We stood there, two sisters who'd survived the worst, holding each other in the safety we'd fought to create. No words needed, just the rhythm of breathing in sync, hearts beating with hard-won peace. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but ours to shape. We'd build it day by day, choice by choice, far from the lies that once defined us. Together, we'd learned that family wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about choosing each other, again and again, especially when the world tried to tear you apart. Alright, time to close the book on this one. Appreciate you hanging out while I threw in my 2 cents here and there. Hopefully a few of them were clever enough to stick. Like the video, it helps more than you think.